July 1944, Normandy hedgerows. A massive German Panther tank sat abandoned in a muddy field, its crew nowhere to be found. Captain Richard Mason of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division approached cautiously, his boots squelching in the rain-soaked earth. The beast before him was legendary, feared across every battlefield where it appeared. Its sloped armor had deflected countless American shells. Its 75mm gun had destroyed entire Sherman platoons from impossible distances. But now it was theirs. Mason's orders were simple. Get this monster running and take it back to Allied lines for evaluation. Intelligence desperately wanted to understand why German armor was so devastatingly effective. What they discovered in the following hours would shock the American tank crews and reveal a fatal flaw that the Nazi propaganda machine had desperately tried to hide. The Panther wasn't just dangerous to its enemies, it was a death trap for its own crew. Shutter, call to action. If you're fascinated by untold World War II stories and want to discover more shocking truths about the weapons that shaped history, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We dive deep into the real stories behind the legends, the ones that never made it into the history books. Now, let's find out what happened when American soldiers got their hands on Germany's most feared tank. Chapter 1. The Beast in the Mud. The Panther tank, or Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther, to give it its full German designation, was supposed to be the Third Reich's answer to the Soviet T-34. When German forces crashed into Russia in 1941, they encountered a rude awakening. The T-34's sloped armor and reliable design made it superior to anything the Wehrmacht had in their arsenal. Hitler was furious. He demanded a response. The result was the Panther, first deployed at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. On paper, it was magnificent. Weighing 45 tons, it combined the mobility of a medium tank with the firepower of a heavy. Its 75mm KWK-42L70 gun could penetrate any Allied tank from over a mile away. The sloped frontal armor, 80mm thick at 55 degrees, was virtually impenetrable to American 75mm guns at combat ranges. German propaganda celebrated it as a wonder weapon. Newsreels showed Panthers rolling invincibly through Russian villages, their guns barking death at Soviet armor. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy on D-Day, the Panther's reputation had grown to mythical proportions. American tank crews called them German big cats and dreaded encountering them. Captain Mason had seen what Panthers could do. 3 weeks earlier, his unit had stumbled into a Panther ambush near St. Lo. 5 Shermans were burning wrecks before they even saw what hit them. The Panther had fired from a tree line over 200 yards away, a distance where American tanks couldn't even hope to penetrate its armor. Mason had watched helplessly as his fellow tankers burned alive, their hatches blown shut by the force of the German shells penetrating their thin armor. Now, standing before this abandoned giant, Mason felt a mix of emotions. Fear, certainly, but also curiosity and perhaps a chance for revenge. The Panther in front of him appeared intact. No visible battle damage. The crew had simply vanished, probably fled during an Allied artillery barrage. The hastily abandoned tank still had its hatches open, and personal items were scattered around the commander's cupola. A photograph of a German woman and child, half-eaten black bread, a canteen. Mason climbed onto the hull, his hands gripping the rain-slicked armor. Technical Sergeant James Rodriguez, the unit's best mechanic, followed him up. They needed to understand this machine, but more importantly, they needed to get it running. What they were about to discover would change everything they thought they knew about German engineering. Chapter 2. Inside the Iron Coffin. Dropping through the commander's hatch into the Panther's interior was like entering another world. The German tank was spacious compared to the cramped American Shermans. But as Rodriguez began his inspection, he immediately noticed something wrong. "Sir, you need to see this," Rodriguez called out, his flashlight illuminating the engine compartment access. Mason squeezed through the cramped fighting compartment, past the massive breech of the 75mm gun to where his mechanic was pointing. The entire rear of the tank's interior was coated with a thin film of fuel and oil. The smell was overwhelming, a dangerous mix of gasoline fumes and lubricant. Rodriguez ran his finger along a fuel line, and it came away dripping. "This whole thing is one spark away from going up," Rodriguez said quietly. "The fuel lines are leaking, the seals are shot, and look here." He pointed to the engine deck above them. "The ventilation is terrible. Any fuel vapor just sits here waiting for ignition." The Panther used a Maybach HL230 P30 engine, a powerful 700 horsepower V12 that could push the 45-ton tank to speeds of 34 mph. On paper, it was impressive. In reality, it was a nightmare. The engine ran hot, very hot, and the cooling system was barely adequate. The fuel pumps were prone to leaking, and the entire power plant was crammed into a space that made maintenance nearly impossible in field conditions. But the real problem was the fuel itself. Unlike American tanks, which ran on diesel, the Panther used gasoline. Gasoline is far more volatile than diesel. It vaporizes easily and creates explosive fuel-air mixtures. In a tank that already leaked fuel and ran scorching hot, it was a recipe for disaster. Rodriguez continued his inspection, documenting everything. The transmission was another weak point, a complex piece of engineering that required perfect maintenance. The final drives were undersized for the tank's weight. The interleaved road wheels, while providing a smooth ride, trapped mud and debris that could freeze solid in winter, immobilizing the tank completely. "The Germans built a race car when they needed a truck," Rodriguez muttered. "This thing is temperamental as hell." Mason was beginning to understand why they'd found this Panther abandoned. It hadn't been knocked out by Allied fire. It had simply broken down. Intelligence reports suggested that mechanical failures accounted for more Panther losses than combat damage, especially in the early production runs. The Germans were so desperate to get Panthers to the front that they'd rushed production, and quality control had suffered. But the fire risk, that was something else entirely. Mason had heard rumors that Panthers could brew up from a single hit, not because the armor was penetrated, but because the fuel system was so vulnerable. Now he was seeing it firsthand. They needed to test this theory, and that meant getting the Panther running. Chapter 3. The Wounded Predator. Getting the Panther operational took 2 days of intensive work. Rodriguez and his team of mechanics worked around the clock, guided by a captured German technical manual that none of them could fully read. They patched fuel lines with American spare parts, topped off the fluids, and managed to coax the Maybach engine to life. The sound was incredible, a deep, throaty roar that made the ground vibrate. Inside the tank, the noise was deafening, despite the crew wearing headsets. The engine compartment temperature climbed rapidly. Within minutes of startup, the engine deck was hot enough to boil water. Mason sat in the commander's position, feeling the massive tank shudder beneath him. They'd painted rough American markings on the hull and turret to avoid being shot by their own side, a very real concern. Now came the real test. They would drive this Panther back to Allied lines, about 15 miles through contested territory. The drive began smoothly enough. The Panther's suspension was remarkably sophisticated, and despite the rough Norman terrain, the ride was smoother than any Sherman Mason had experienced. The visibility from the commander's cupola was excellent. He could see why German tank commanders were so effective. They had better tools to work with. But problems emerged quickly. After just 5 miles, the transmission began making ominous grinding sounds. The engine temperature gauge climbed into the red zone. Rodriguez, serving as driver, reported that the steering was becoming sluggish, a sign that the final drives were overheating. Then came the first fire. They were crossing an open field when Rodriguez suddenly yelled, "Smoke in the engine compartment!" Through the internal vision ports, Mason could see wisps of gray smoke curling up from the rear. The engine was so hot that leaked fuel was beginning to vaporize and ignite on contact with the scorching metal surfaces. "Stop! Stop the tank!" Mason ordered. They threw open all the hatches, and smoke poured out like a chimney. The crew bailed out, grabbing fire extinguishers. Rodriguez sprayed foam into the engine compartment while Mason and the others stood ready to run. For 5 terrifying minutes, they fought to control a fire that threatened to consume the entire tank. The flames were finally extinguished, but the incident had proven the point. The Panther hadn't been hit by enemy fire. It hadn't struck a mine. It had simply been driven for 5 miles, and it had nearly burned itself to death. "This is insane," Rodriguez said, his face covered in soot. "These things are mobile crematoriums." They let the engine cool for an hour before attempting to restart. When they did, the temperature climbed even faster. The damaged cooling system couldn't handle the heat load. Leaked fuel continued to drip onto hot surfaces, creating a constant fire hazard. Mason made a decision. They would continue, but slowly, with frequent stops to let the engine cool. What should have been a 3-hour drive became a 2-day ordeal of constant mechanical problems and near fires. Chapter 4. The Burning Truth. By the time they limped into Allied lines, the Panther had caught fire 3 more times. Each time they'd managed to extinguish the flames before catastrophic damage occurred, but it was clear this tank was a death trap. Word spread quickly through the American tank units. The feared German Panther was actually a mechanical disaster. Intelligence officers descended on the captured tank immediately. They conducted exhaustive tests, documenting every flaw, every weakness, every design compromise. What they discovered confirmed Mason's experience and revealed even more problems. The Panther's fuel system was criminally negligent in its safety design. Fuel lines ran alongside hot exhaust pipes with inadequate shielding. The fuel pumps were mounted in locations where they vibrated constantly, loosening connections and creating leaks. The fuel tanks themselves were positioned where any penetrating hit, even to the lower hull, could rupture them and flood the crew compartment with gasoline. Combat reports from the Eastern Front told a horrifying story. Soviet tankers had learned that they didn't need to penetrate a Panther's frontal armor to kill it. A solid hit anywhere on the hull, even if it didn't penetrate, could jar the fuel system enough to cause leaks. The subsequent engine heat would do the rest. Panthers were burning from non-penetrating hits at alarming rates. Even more damning were the statistics from German maintenance records that had been captured. Of the Panthers deployed to Normandy, fewer than half were lost to enemy action. The rest broke down or caught fire from mechanical failures. Some German units reported that their Panthers had an operational readiness rate of less than 30%, meaning 2/3 of their most feared tanks were in repair shops at any given time. The interleaved road wheel design, while providing excellent ground pressure distribution and ride quality, was a maintenance nightmare. In muddy conditions, debris would pack between the wheels. In winter, this debris would freeze solid, effectively immobilizing the tank. Replacing an inner road wheel required removing up to 8 outer wheels, a job that took trained mechanics an entire day. In combat conditions, it was often impossible. The transmission and final drives were undersized for the Panther's weight. They were based on designs intended for lighter tanks and simply couldn't handle the stress. Breakdowns were routine, especially when the tank was driven hard in combat conditions. German crews reported that many Panthers never made it to the battlefield. They broke down during the approach march. But the fire risk remained the most shocking discovery. American engineers calculated that a Panther was approximately 4 times more likely to catch fire from mechanical causes than a Sherman was from combat damage. The very thing German propaganda had mocked the Sherman for, its tendency to catch fire and burn, earning it the grim nickname Ronson, light's first time every time, was actually worse in the Panther. The difference was that when Shermans burned, it was usually because they'd been hit by enemy fire. Panthers burned from simply being driven. Chapter 5. The myth versus the machine. The captured Panther became a traveling exhibition, shown to American tank crews across the European theater. The goal was twofold: demystify the German superweapon and teach crews how to fight it. What they learned changed tactics and saved lives. "The Panther is a magnificent gun on a terrible chassis," one intelligence officer summarized. The 75mm gun was indeed devastating, accurate, powerful, and capable of destroying any Allied tank at extreme range. The armor, when working as designed, was nearly invulnerable from the front. These were genuine advantages that demanded respect. But the tank's weaknesses were equally profound. The side armor was only 40mm thick, vulnerable to American 76mm guns and even the standard 75mm at close range. The engine deck and rear were weak points, and most importantly, the entire machine was fragile. It needed perfect maintenance, experienced crews, high-quality fuel, and ideal operating conditions to function properly. Germany in 1944 could provide none of these things. Allied bombing had disrupted parts production. Quality steel was diverted to other weapons. Experienced crews were dead or captured, replaced by teenagers with minimal training. Fuel was in short supply, and what was available was often of poor quality, causing additional engine problems. The Panthers that American troops encountered in Normandy and beyond were often operating on their last legs. They'd broken down, been partially repaired with salvaged parts, broken down again, and were now crewed by exhausted men who barely knew how to maintain them. These weren't the wonder weapons of propaganda films. They were sophisticated machines being used far beyond their operational limits. American crews learned new tactics. Don't engage a Panther head-on. Its frontal armor is too strong. Instead, maneuver for side shots. Use high-explosive shells against the tracks and road wheels. Even if you don't penetrate, you might damage the temperamental running gear. Call in artillery or air support. Panthers can't fire back at planes, and they can't run away when their transmissions are failing. Most importantly, be patient. Given enough time, many Panthers would simply break down on their own. Intelligence estimated that for every Panther that reached the battlefield fully operational, 2 more were broken down somewhere along the route. The mechanical attrition rate was staggering. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Germany had invested enormous resources into developing a technically superior tank, only to create a weapon that was too complex for their collapsing industrial base to support. In trying to make the perfect tank, they'd made a tank that worked perfectly only in perfect conditions, conditions that no longer existed. Meanwhile, the Sherman, mocked by German tankers as inferior, just kept running. It was reliable. It was easy to repair. It used widely available diesel fuel. And most importantly, America could build them by the thousands while Germany struggled to produce hundreds of Panthers. The captured Panther that Captain Mason brought back became a symbol of this disconnect between German ambition and reality. It was displayed with signs explaining its flaws, its fire risks, its maintenance requirements. American tank crews would walk around it, noting the thin side armor, the poorly ventilated engine deck, the complex running gear. The beast that had terrified them from across Norman hedgerows suddenly looked vulnerable. Dangerous, yes, but also deeply flawed. Thakurso, Chapter 6. Legacy of Fire. The Panther's design flaws had consequences that extended far beyond mechanical problems. For the German crews who operated them, these tanks were a source of constant dread. They knew that at any moment their mount might burst into flames, not from enemy action, but from its own inherent defects. Survival rates for German tank crews in Panthers were shockingly low, but not always for the reasons one might expect. Yes, they faced overwhelming Allied numerical superiority and constant air attack, but they also faced the possibility that their own tank might become their crematorium. German veterans' accounts from after the war spoke of the constant fear of fire, the smell of fuel leaking into the crew compartment. The knowledge that the engine running inches behind them was hot enough to ignite gasoline vapor. When a Panther was hit and penetrated, crew survival was poor. The ammunition stored in the hull could catastrophically explode. The fuel would ignite almost instantly. The hatches, while well-designed, could jam from the force of a strike. Many German tankers were burned alive not because they couldn't escape, but because fire engulfed the interior too quickly. But even without being hit, Panthers could kill their crews. There are documented cases of Panthers catching fire while parked. The engine heat alone sufficient to ignite leaked fuel. Crews sleeping near their tanks for security were sometimes awakened by flames. Others weren't so lucky. The psychological impact was significant. German tankers became superstitious about their Panthers. They would perform elaborate pre-combat rituals, checking and rechecking fuel lines, praying that this mission wouldn't be the one where their tank betrayed them. Some crews requested transfers to older Panzer IV tanks, which were less capable, but far more reliable and less prone to spontaneous combustion. As the war dragged on and Germany's situation became increasingly desperate, Panther quality deteriorated further. Late-war Panthers were assembled with inferior materials by slave laborers who sometimes sabotaged production with parts that didn't fit properly. These tanks were even more prone to fires and breakdowns. By 1945, finding a fully operational Panther was rare. The tactical impact was enormous. German commanders couldn't rely on their armor in the way they had earlier in the war. Offensive operations had to account for massive mechanical attrition. A unit starting with 20 Panthers might have only 8 operational by the time it reached the battlefield. Those 8 might face hundreds of Allied tanks, supported by overwhelming air power. The strategic impact was even greater. Germany poured resources into Panther production, resources that might have been better spent on more reliable weapons, or on the logistical infrastructure needed to keep any weapons operational. The Panther represented the same kind of thinking that led Germany to develop wonder weapons like the V-2 rocket, technically impressive, but ultimately a waste of limited resources. After the war, when engineers from around the world studied captured German technology, the Panther was seen as a cautionary tale. Yes, it had some excellent features: the gun, the armor slope, the suspension, but it failed in the fundamental requirement of any military vehicle. It wasn't reliable enough for its intended purpose. A tank that's too broken or burned to fight is worthless, no matter how good its specifications look on paper. Modern tank designers learned from the Panther's mistakes. Post-war tanks universally adopted diesel engines, which are far less prone to fires than gasoline engines. Fuel systems were designed with redundancy and safety as primary concerns. Transmissions and running gear were built to handle the stress of the vehicle's weight with margin to spare. The idea that a tank might spontaneously combust from its own mechanical problems became unacceptable. Captain Mason's captured Panther eventually ended up in a military museum where it sits today. The placard next to it tells visitors about its impressive gun and armor, but it also tells the story of the fires, the breakdowns, the fatal flaws that made this fearsome machine its own worst enemy. The burn marks in the engine compartment are still visible, a testament to a design philosophy that prioritized performance over reliability and paid the price in burning steel and dead crews. The German Panther was supposed to be the apex predator of armored warfare, a technological marvel that would turn the tide of battle. Instead, it became a symbol of over-engineering, of ambition exceeding capability, and of the simple truth that in war, reliability often matters more than superiority. The Americans who captured and tested Panthers came away with a new understanding. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the one with the best specifications. It's the one that works when you need it to. And the Panther, for all its fearsome reputation, too often didn't work. Or worse, it worked just long enough to trap its crew inside before bursting into flames. Epilogue. The Last Fire. 78 years after Captain Mason's captured Panther limped into Allied lines, a team of restoration experts at the Tank Museum in Bovington, England, faced an unusual problem. They'd been restoring a Panther OSF, one of only a handful of operational Panthers left in the world, when something unexpected happened during a demonstration run. It caught fire. The year was 2022. The Panther had been meticulously restored over 5 years, using original parts where possible and carefully manufactured replicas where necessary. The team had consulted original German technical manuals, interviewed the few surviving Panther crewmen still alive, and applied modern safety standards to the fuel system. They'd done everything right. And yet 10 minutes into what was supposed to be a simple demonstration drive around the museum grounds, smoke began pouring from the engine deck. The driver immediately shut down and evacuated. Museum fire suppression teams responded within seconds. The fire was contained before it could cause catastrophic damage, but the message was clear. Even with modern restoration techniques, modern safety equipment, and careful operation, the Panther's fundamental design flaws remained. David Willey, the museum's curator of tanks, stood looking at the smoke-stained engine deck and shook his head. "We did everything we could to make this safe," he said to the gathered restoration team. "Modern fuel lines, temperature sensors, fire suppression systems that the original crews could only dream of, and it still tried to burn itself to death." The investigation revealed what engineers in 1944 had discovered. The Maybach engine simply ran too hot for the fuel system design. Even with modern seals and hoses, the heat stress was enormous. A tiny leak, microscopic really, had allowed fuel vapor to accumulate in a pocket near the exhaust manifold. One spark from the electrical system, and the vapor ignited. This incident became a teaching moment for the thousands of visitors who saw the damaged Panther in the weeks that followed. The museum added it to their exhibit on wartime tank design, with explanatory panels detailing what had happened. "This is a 2022 restoration catching fire under ideal conditions," one panel read. "Imagine being a 19-year-old German conscript in 1944, operating this machine in combat with poor fuel, minimal maintenance, and enemy shells landing around you." The Panther at Bovington was eventually repaired and returned to static display, deemed too dangerous to operate regularly. It joined dozens of other Panthers in museums worldwide, most of which will never run again precisely because the fire risk is considered unacceptable by modern safety standards. But the story of the Panther continues to fascinate military historians, engineers, and tank enthusiasts. It represents one of the great paradoxes of World War II, a weapon that was simultaneously too good and not good enough, too sophisticated for its time, yet not reliable enough for its purpose. A testament to engineering ambition that became a cautionary tale about the dangers of over-complexity. In 2019, a team of historians gained access to previously classified Soviet archives detailing their extensive testing of captured Panthers. The Soviets had been even more thorough than the Americans, conducting brutal endurance trials to understand German tank technology. Their conclusions were damning. The Panther represents fascist thinking, impressive on parade, deadly in short bursts, but incapable of sustained effort. It is a weapon designed by engineers who never had to fight in one. The Soviet testers had run Panthers until they broke, documenting every failure. Their records showed that the average Panther could operate for approximately 150 kilometers before requiring significant mechanical intervention. By comparison, the Soviet T-34 could run for over 1,000 kilometers between major services. The German tank that was supposed to counter the T-34 had succeeded in armor and firepower, but had catastrophically failed in the most important metric: operational reliability. Modern tank design owes much to the lessons learned from the Panther. When engineers at General Dynamics designed the M1 Abrams in the 1970s, they studied every major tank from World War II onward. The Panther was specifically cited as an example of what not to do. Don't use gasoline engines. Don't under-engineer the transmission for the vehicle's weight. Don't make maintenance unnecessarily complex, and above all, don't sacrifice reliability for performance specifications. The final word on the Panther perhaps belongs to Otto Carius, one of Germany's most successful tank aces, who destroyed over 150 enemy tanks during the war. In his post-war memoir, he wrote about his experience with Panthers. They were magnificent when they worked, but that was the problem. They worked only when everything was perfect. In war, nothing is ever perfect. Give me a Panther against one enemy tank in ideal conditions, and I'll win. Give me 10 Panthers against 100 enemy tanks in real conditions, and half my Panthers will break down before we even make contact. That's not a weapon. That's a liability. Today, the few operational Panthers that exist are treated like temperamental celebrities. They're started rarely, driven carefully, and monitored constantly. Their public appearances are planned months in advance, with fire crews standing by and safety protocols that would have seemed like science fiction to their original crews. Even then, incidents like the Bovington fire remind us that some fundamental design flaws cannot be engineered away. They can only be managed. Captain Mason's captured Panther, the one that caught fire 3 times on its journey to Allied lines, was eventually scrapped for metal. But its story lived on in intelligence reports, training manuals, and the institutional memory of American armor forces. It taught a generation of tank designers that specifications on paper mean nothing if the machine can't survive contact with reality. The Panther's legacy is complex. It influenced post-war tank design significantly. The emphasis on sloped armor, powerful guns, and sophisticated suspension systems all owed something to German engineering. But it also served as a permanent reminder that reliability, maintainability, and safety must be fundamental design priorities, not afterthoughts. A tank crew that's afraid their own vehicle will burn them alive cannot fight effectively, no matter how impressive the gun or how thick the armor. In the end, the German Panther achieved a kind of immortality, not as the wonder weapon its creators intended, but as a cautionary tale. It sits in museums around the world, its sleek lines and powerful guns still impressive to modern eyes. But look closer, and you'll see the scorch marks in the engine compartment, the overly complex running gear, the fuel lines that run too close to hot metal. You'll see a machine that promised invincibility but delivered vulnerability, that offered protection but became a trap. The Americans who captured that first Panther in July 1944 stumbled onto a secret that would help win the war. The enemy's best weapon was also their biggest liability. And sometimes the most important intelligence doesn't come from breaking codes or interrogating prisoners. Sometimes it comes from simply watching your enemy's superweapon set itself on fire.